On a quiet street outside Columbus, Ohio, there's a 15-year-old sedan parked in front of a house nobody has ever remodeled. The man who lives there is worth more than everyone else on that block combined, and not one neighbor has ever guessed it. 3 houses down, a newer truck sits in a driveway that gets noticed by everyone who drives past. Here's the strange part. Most people assume the driveway tells you who has money. It almost never does. The truck is often financed. The sedan is often paid off, sitting on top of an account most people would never expect. So why would someone who could afford anything choose to drive something so plain? The answer isn't modesty. It's a decision made deliberately. And once you see why the wealthy make it, you'll never read a driveway the same way again. Miss this, and you'll spend years chasing the wrong signal, working hard toward a version of success that was never actually real. My name is Alex, and if you've ever felt like you're doing everything right, but still somehow behind, stay with me. That feeling isn't about effort. I'm going to show you what the data says the wealthy actually spend their money on, and the exact math behind why looking rich and getting rich pull in opposite directions. Once you understand this, you'll start making the quiet decisions they make, years ahead of everyone still trying to prove something. And that pattern starts with a fact almost nobody expects about who these people actually are. Who actually becomes a millionaire? Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If you had to guess the most common job among American millionaires, what would you say? Investment banker? Tech founder? Somebody who inherited it? You'd be wrong on all 3. And the actual answer says something important about the whole system. Take a woman named Diane Holbrook. She taught 7th grade science outside Dayton, Ohio for 31 years. She drove a Toyota Corolla for most of that time, packed her lunch every single day, and retired last year with a paid-off house and just over $1.4 million sitting in her retirement accounts. Nobody at that school would have guessed it. She never mentioned it. There was no Rolex Datejust on her wrist, and no reason for anyone to suspect she was quietly building the exact kind of wealth most people spend their whole life chasing. Diane isn't the exception. She's closer to the rule. Right now, close to 80% of American millionaires are first generation. That means they didn't inherit the money. They built it themselves, slowly, mostly through steady contributions to a workplace retirement account and a house that eventually got paid off. No trust fund, no inheritance check, just decades of the same boring habit, repeated without much drama. And here's where it gets even more surprising. The job titles behind these numbers are almost aggressively ordinary. Teachers, engineers, accountants, small business owner. The kind of person who mowed his own lawn for 3 decades and never once traded in a working car just because a newer model came out. Fidelity currently tracks more than 500,000 Americans whose workplace retirement account alone has crossed the $1 million mark. Not their whole net worth, just the retirement account, built one paycheck at a time. Now, you might be thinking, sure, but that takes forever. And you're right, it does. The typical American doesn't cross into millionaire territory until somewhere around age 50. That's not a quick win. That's 25, maybe 30 years of consistent, unremarkable decisions stacking on top of each other, until one day the number is simply there. Which raises the real question. If the path is that available, why do so few people actually walk it? Because the boring road looks like nothing while you're on it. There's no moment where contributing $400 to a 401k feels like progress. It just feels like $400 leaving your paycheck. Meanwhile, the exciting road, the new truck, the vacation everyone sees, gives you something to show for it immediately. One path pays off in a headline. The other pays off in a bank statement nobody else ever reads. That's the trade nearly every millionaire in this country made without realizing it was a trade at all. They picked the boring option over and over, long enough that boring turned into freedom. And once you understand that the wealth itself was never flashy to begin with, the next question practically asks itself, if these are the people quietly building real money, what do they actually drive home in? What millionaires actually drive? Try this the next time you're at a red light. Look at the car next to you and guess whether the driver is wealthy. Most people get it backwards more often than they'd like to admit. Picture a man named Ray Castellano, a general contractor outside Phoenix. Ray's net worth quietly crossed $2 million a few years back, mostly through smart real estate and a retirement account he never touched. He still drives a Toyota Tacoma with over 110,000 miles on it. Meanwhile, his neighbor leases a Range Rover Sport every 3 years and has maybe $11,000 in savings. If you had to bet on which one was actually rich, the truck would be the last car you'd pick. And that's exactly the point. This isn't just Ray. It's a pattern that shows up everywhere once you know to look for it. The single most common car brand among American millionaires is Toyota, followed closely by Honda. Not Mercedes-Benz, not BMW, not some Italian brand that costs more than a semester of college. And this holds up at the very top of the wealth ladder, too. Warren Buffett still lives in the same modest Omaha house he bought back in 1958 for about $31,000. And for years, the founder of Amazon famously drove a Honda Accord to work. Here's a number that might actually surprise you. Currently, well over half of households earning $250,000 a year or more don't drive a luxury brand at all. They're driving the same dependable, forgettable cars as everyone else on the road, which means the entire mental image most of us carry around, the wealthy person behind the wheel of a Mercedes-Benz GLE, is mostly wrong. So why does this keep catching people off guard? Because we've been trained to read the wrong signal. A flashy car announces itself. It's loud, it's visible, and it gets noticed in about 4 seconds flat. A paid-off Toyota Highlander announces nothing. It just sits in the driveway doing its job, which means our brains skip right past it and assume the person driving it is doing fine, but nothing more. We're not bad at spotting wealth because we're careless. We're bad at it because wealthy people have quietly stopped broadcasting it. And once you notice that gap, a bigger question starts to form. If the wealthy can clearly afford whatever they want, and they're choosing the Tacoma over the Range Rover Sport anyway, that's not an accident. That's not modesty for its own sake either. Ray isn't driving that truck because he can't picture himself in something nicer. He's driving it because somewhere along the way, he ran a version of this math in his head and decided the nicer car simply wasn't worth what it would cost him. That decision, repeated by millions of people like him, is the actual engine behind most of the quiet wealth in this country. Not a secret formula, not some advantage the rest of us don't have access to. Just the same choice, made over and over, car after car, year after year. Which brings up something worth asking honestly. If driving the plain car is clearly the smarter move on paper, why does almost everyone still feel the pull toward the flashy one instead? Why real wealth stays quiet? Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The person bragging about money in the room is almost never the person with the most of it. Why would that be true? Think about a woman named Wanda Ferris, a dental hygienist in Tulsa, who spent years financing a new Cadillac Escalade every few seasons and never missed a chance to mention it. Her coworkers assumed she was doing great. In reality, Wanda was one bad month away from missing a payment, and she knew it, which is exactly why she kept bringing it up. The mentioning was doing a job. It was covering for something. That's the pattern hiding underneath almost all loud spending. It's rarely about the object itself. It's a message aimed at other people, and the people who need to send that message the loudest are usually the ones least sure it's true. New money, insecure money, the kind that hasn't fully convinced itself yet, is the money that talks. Settled money doesn't need an audience. Once your bank account genuinely has your back, a stranger's opinion in a parking lot stops meaning anything at all. This isn't a new discovery, either. Back in 1899, an economist named Thorstein Veblen coined the term conspicuous consumption after watching the wealthy of his era burn money on visible luxury for one reason: to broadcast status to everyone below them. For most of the last century, that was the entire game. Bigger house, louder car, more of everything. All of it pointed outward at a crowd. But somewhere along the way, that game quietly changed. A researcher named Elizabeth Currid Halkett studied decades of American spending data and found that the wealthy had shifted strategies almost entirely. She called this new pattern inconspicuous consumption. Instead of logos aimed at strangers, today's wealthy pour money into things you can't see from the sidewalk. Elite schooling for their kids, great doctors, trainers, the kind of care that buys back their own time. The signals still exist. They just point sideways now, toward other people who already understand them, instead of downward at a crowd meant to be impressed. And honestly, isn't that a smarter trade? A Patek Philippe on your wrist gets noticed by a stranger for maybe 4 seconds. A properly funded retirement account gets noticed by nobody. and outlasts every single one of those strangers. There's a colder reason for the silence, too, one most people never consider. Looking rich paints a target on your back. The moment people believe you have money, the whole dynamic around you shifts. Friends start doing quiet math about what you might owe them. Distant relatives resurface out of nowhere. Every conversation grows a hidden agenda you can feel but can't quite name. Visible wealth turns you into a mark. For scams, for the loan that never comes back, for the business idea that only needs your signature to get moving. The wealthy tend to learn this the hard way, and once they do, they rarely forget it. Discretion doesn't just protect the money, it protects the relationships around it. Because when nobody can tell what you actually have, the people in your life have to like you for reasons that have nothing to do with your bank account. That's not paranoia. That's just what happens once you've been burned once. So the silence isn't modesty, and it isn't an accident either. It's a decision made for very specific reasons by people who already ran the numbers on what noise actually costs them. And that number turns out to be a lot bigger than most people expect. The real cost of looking rich. Here's a number that might ruin your next car shopping trip, in a good way. What if the SUV sitting in the dealership lot wasn't really priced at what's on the sticker, but at what it quietly takes away from you 20 years from now? Meet a man named Gary Whitfield, an HVAC technician outside Charlotte who's 52 years old and thinking hard about retirement for the first time. A few years back, Gary was staring down two options: a BMW X5, financed at a payment close to the national average for new vehicles, or a used Toyota Highlander, financed closer to what the average used car buyer pays. The BMW was the one that made people glance twice in the parking lot. The Highlander was the one that got him to work. Right now, the average new car payment in this country runs about $770 a month. The average used car payment runs closer to $531. That gap, $239 a month, doesn't sound dramatic on its own. It's the price of a nice dinner out, maybe two. But Gary didn't spend it. He invested it instead. And here's where the math actually gets uncomfortable. Put that same $239 a month into an index fund, earning around 7% a year, and over 10 years it grows to about $41,400. Give it 15 years, and it becomes roughly $75,700. Stretch it to 20 years, the kind of window someone Gary's age might realistically have left before retirement, and that same unremarkable monthly gap turns into around $124,500. Let that sit for a second. That's not the price of the car. That's the price of the choice. And here's the part that should really catch the attention of anyone over 50 watching this. Right now, the IRS lets workers age 50 and older contribute an extra $8,000 a year to their 401k on top of the regular limit. If you're between 60 and 63, that catch-up jumps to $11,250. That's not a hypothetical opportunity. That's real room. The government is currently handing you to close the gap, and it's sitting right there waiting to be used by the exact same money that might otherwise be going toward a car payment nobody will remember by next year. Now, you might be thinking, it's just a car. It's not like I'm throwing money away. And sure, on the surface, that's fair. Everybody needs a way to get to work. But the flashy purchase never travels alone. It drags a whole chain behind it. Higher insurance, pricier repairs, sometimes a bigger house or a nicer neighborhood that starts to feel necessary just to match it. One loud decision quietly multiplies into several more. And every dollar spent keeping up with that image is a dollar that will never compound into anything else. Gary kept the Highlander 2 years past when most people trade in. He didn't do it because he loved the color. He did it because he'd already run the numbers. And once you've seen what the gap actually turns into, going back to the flashy option starts to feel less like a treat and more like a quiet withdrawal from your own future, which raises the obvious question. If all that restraint isn't buying status, and it isn't buying attention either, what exactly is it buying instead? What wealth buys instead of stuff? Here's a question worth asking yourself honestly. If you suddenly had enough money that a missed paycheck couldn't touch you, what would actually change about your Monday morning? Think about a woman named Renata Cole, a hospital billing coordinator in Sacramento, who spent 14 years driving the same Honda CR-V while two coworkers leased a new Lexus RX every few years and teased her about the mileage on her dashboard. Renata wasn't saving out of fear. She just kept doing one quiet thing most people skip entirely. She parked her emergency fund somewhere that actually paid her. That decision matters more than it sounds like. Right now, the average traditional savings account in this country pays somewhere around 0.5% a year. Meanwhile, the better high-yield savings accounts are currently paying north of 4%. On $50,000, that's the difference between earning roughly $300 a year and earning over $2,000 a year for doing absolutely nothing except choosing a different bank. Renata's coworkers were paying for a Lexus RX. Renata was quietly collecting rent from her own cash. But here's the part that actually matters more than the interest rate. What was Renata buying with all of that? Not a bigger number to stare at. Freedom, in the most literal sense, a paid-off house, a retirement account that keeps growing whether she feels like checking it or not. An emergency fund deep enough that a rough diagnosis or a sudden layoff becomes an inconvenience instead of a catastrophe. Picture what that actually looks like on an ordinary morning. A boss makes an unreasonable demand, and the person with real savings can simply say no, because a few missed paychecks wouldn't touch their life. An industry shifts, and instead of panicking, they can retrain, take a breath, or start something new on their own timeline. A family emergency lands, and they can drop everything without the whole structure collapsing underneath them. That's not a hypothetical. That's what all those boring, forgettable decisions were quietly building the entire time. Not more stuff. Room to breathe. And there's a bigger reason this pattern matters beyond any one person's life. The country is currently sitting in the middle of the largest generational wealth handoff in its history, with something close to $124 trillion expected to move from older Americans to their heirs over the coming decades. That number sounds enormous, and it is. But study after study shows that a huge share of family fortunes gets spent down within 1 or 2 generations of being inherited, usually by heirs who learned how to look wealthy instead of how to stay wealthy. The families who actually hold on to it are almost always the quiet ones, not because they got lucky with a bigger inheritance, but because wealth was treated like a habit at their dinner table instead of a performance. What gets modeled at home outlasts anything anyone ever parks in the driveway. Renata never explained any of this to her coworkers. She didn't need to. She just kept feeding the same accounts year after year, while the Lexus RX got traded in for a newer one every few seasons. On paper, for a long time, it looked like she was falling behind. She wasn't falling behind. She was quietly building an exit. And once you understand that the whole point was never the stuff, a harder question starts to surface. If the wealthy figured this out, who exactly is doing all that spending we keep noticing? Who's actually broke and flashing? Here's a question that flips this whole idea on its head. If the truly wealthy are hiding it, then who exactly is doing all the flashing you keep seeing? Picture a man named Dwight Sorensen, a regional sales rep in suburban Dallas, who leases a new Cadillac Escalade every 2 years and wears a Rolex Datejust he mentions more often than his own kids' names. On paper, at a backyard barbecue, Dwight looks like the richest guy on the block. In reality, the Escalade is financed, the Rolex is on a payment plan through the jeweler, and his savings account currently holds less than a month of expenses. He's not hiding wealth. He's hiding the absence of it, and the mentioning is doing most of the heavy lifting. Dwight isn't rare either. Right now, a meaningful share of Americans earning under $100,000 a year still finance a luxury vehicle, stretching for a lifestyle they haven't actually earned yet, and paying interest for the privilege of looking like they have. That's not a coincidence. That's the whole system working exactly as designed, just aimed at the wrong target. Now put Dwight next to somebody like Renata from before, still driving that same aging Honda CR-V, still funding the accounts nobody sees. If you line the two of them up at that same barbecue and ask the crowd who was doing better financially, almost everyone would point at Dwight, and almost everyone would be wrong. Renata could buy and sell him several times over without blinking, and she'd never bring it up. That contrast points to the real trap most people fall into without noticing. Comparison is the fastest route to broke. The second you start measuring your life against the loudest person in the room, you start spending money you don't have on things you don't need to impress people who genuinely aren't thinking about you nearly as much as you assumed. Every dollar handed over to keep pace in that race gets transferred to a version of success that isn't even real, admired for about 4 seconds by a crowd that forgets your car by the time they reach the parking lot. And here's the part that stings a little if you sit with it. What does all that flashing actually earn Dwight in return? Not respect, not really. The neighbor, impressed by the Escalade, mostly feels a flicker of envy, or quietly wonders how he affords it, or files him away as someone trying a bit too hard. Real respect gets built on how someone treats people and what they actually do, never on a badge stuck to the front of a leased SUV. So here's the idea that ties this whole thing together. Your wealth was never what you spent. It's what you managed to keep. Every status purchase skipped isn't deprivation. It's a deposit into the version of your life where money finally stops being something you worry about at 2 in the morning. The people we've talked about, Diane with her paid-off house in Dayton, Ray still driving that Tacoma outside Phoenix, Renata quietly building her exit in Sacramento. They all took the same dollars everyone else was burning on appearances and pointed them at something that actually grows instead. That's the entire secret, and it's almost annoyingly simple. It's just very hard to do while the neighbor's new Escalade is sitting in the driveway right next door. Once you've seen the pattern, you can't really unsee it anymore. And once you can't unsee it, the only real question left is what you're going to do with that the next time you're standing in a dealership or staring at your own bank statement, wondering which road you're actually on. The quiet ones were never behind. So here's what it actually comes down to. Wealth was never about being seen. It was about being free. The loud spender needs every paycheck to keep covering the image he built, and the quiet one already bought her way out of that trap years ago. A few things worth carrying with you. Looking rich and being rich pull in opposite directions. Settled money doesn't need an audience. Comparison is one of the fastest ways to quietly go broke. And the difference between the two paths usually comes down to boring decisions, repeated for decades, that nobody ever applauds. Next time you're sizing someone up by their driveway, ask yourself what you're actually not seeing, and take a real look at your own spending. Is it going toward things that grow or things that get noticed for 4 seconds and then forgotten? If this changed how you think about the car in your own driveway or the account nobody sees, tell me about it. I read every comment, and that's genuinely where the best conversations on this channel happen. See you in the next one.